Deepwater divers are the madcaps of the diving community. They are the ones that explore the dark labyrinths of underwater caves and the depths of the oceans. Essentially, claustrophobia incarnate. One such daredevil was a man named Dave Shaw, an Australian scuba diver, technical diver, and an airline pilot. Shaw's story is one of bravery, mystery, and one that ultimately ends in the worst possible way. Dave Shaw was born on July 20th, 1954, and his life was adventurous and exciting. Before joining the airline Cathay Pacific, Shaw flew for Mission Aviation Fellowship in Papua New Guinea and Tanzania, and he piloted agricultural aircraft in South Australia and New South Wales. However, it was his passion for diving that led him to the most extreme and dangerous places on Earth, descending with deep dive gas mixes at extreme pressures. Shaw knew very well the risks involved. At such depths, oxygen can become, in a way, toxic, and nitrogen can cause narcosis, a state that divers describe as being similar to drinking several martinis on an empty stomach. Shaken, not stirred, obviously. Helium isn't any safer as it may also cause nervous fits, and if a diver ascends too quickly, the gases forced into their tissues under pressure can form bubbles, causing a condition known as the bends. This can lead to severe pain, paralysis, or even death, obviously extremely dangerous in deep bodies of water. To minimize these risks, divers must spend hours ascending slowly, allowing their bodies to decompress safely. There's even a saying among the divers, if you do the depth, you do the time. One of the most exciting yet dangerous dive sites is Bushman's Hole. It is located on a Mount Carmel game farm in South Africa. This vast crater, surrounded by veld and termite mounds, is hidden from view until you reach the rim. The crater's entrance is narrow and claustrophobic. It leads to a vast, dark chamber, which creates an otherworldly experience, as if you're spacewalking. Deon Dyer had already logged about 200 dives when he was invited to join some South Africa Cave Diving Association divers at Bushman's Hole over the 1994 Christmas break. They planned a descent to 492 feet and asked Deon to dive support. He was absolutely thrilled. For young cave divers like Deon Dyer, Bushman's Hole was irresistible. Deon, from a town near Johannesburg, was an adventurer at heart. He shot his first buck at 10, raced cars at 17, played with motorcycles, and designed loud car stereos. Diving was another of his passions. He couldn't sit still, never ever ever, said his younger brother, Werner. He said if he had a choice of how to go out in life, he'd like to go out diving, recalls his father, Theo. However, Deon's mother, Marie, begged him not to go. In 1993, Bushman's Hole had already taken the life of a diver named Eben Laden. He blacked out at around 200 feet. A dive buddy rushed him to the surface, but Laden didn't survive. And then on December 17th, 1994, the hole claimed the life of Deon Dyer. For Mother Marie and Father Theo, the nightmare started with a policeman's knock at the door. They then rushed to Mount Carmel, where slowly the story came out. The team had been doing a practice dive, and on the way back up at 196 feet, Deon seemed to be doing fine. He even gave the OK signal to his buddy using his hands, and so the group continued ascending. But at 164 feet, they noticed a light below them. A quick and confused diver count came up one head short. Team leader Dietlov Giliomi wasn't sure what was happening. He desperately started swimming down, but then was forced to stop when he realized the light below him was already more than 100 feet deeper and fading fast. I decided it was a suicide chase, he wrote in the accident report. No one knows for sure what killed Deon. The best guess is deep water blackout from carbon dioxide buildup. 2 weeks after the accident, his father Theo paid to bring in a small remotely operated sub. It found Deon's dive helmet on the floor of Bushman's Hole, but there was no sign of his body. Having realised that Deon would probably stay in that hole forever, Theo and Marie put a commemorative plaque on a rock wall above the entry pool. He had the most majestic grave in the country, and I said this will be his final resting place. Those are the words of Father Theo. 10 years later, in October of 2004, Dave Shaw called Theo Dyer. "I will go and fetch your son," he said. Theo immediately responded, "Yes, absolutely yes." More than anything in that moment, he realised he wanted to see his son again, to have him back. And Dave was a man of his word. And so the time came for Dave to retrieve Deon. 10 minutes into his dive, Dave Shaw started to look for the bottom of Bushman's hole. Complete blackness pressed in on him from all sides, and he directed his light downwards, hoping for a flash of rock or mud, but visibility was poor. Shaw was in an alien world, more than 800 feet below the surface pool that marks the entrance into the hole. He wore his black, crushed neoprene dry suit. On his back, he carried a closed-circuit rebreather set, which, unlike traditional open-circuit scuba gear, this recycled the gas that Shaw breathed, scrubbing out the carbon dioxide that he exhaled and adding oxygen back in. He carried 6 cylinders of gas with him. On the surface world, Shaw would barely have been able to move. But in the water, descending the shot line guiding him from the cave's entrance all the way down to the bottom, he was essentially weightless. At that moment, Dave Shaw was a very happy man. He touched down on the cave's sloping bottom, clipped off of the rope and started swimming. There really was no time to waste on this mission. Every minute he spent on the bottom would add more than an hour of decompression time on the way up. Remember, you do the depth, you do the time. But still, Shaw felt quite relaxed, enjoying that he was the first human to ever lay line at this depth, and then suddenly he stopped. About 50 feet to his left, perfectly illuminated in the water, was a human body. It was on its back, the arms reaching towards the surface. Shaw knew immediately who it was. Deon Dyer. Shaw turned immediately, unspooling cave line as he went. Up close, he could see that Deon's tanks and dive harness, still in situ around his black and tan wetsuit, was all intact. Deon's head and hands, exposed to the water for all this time, were now unfortunately totally skeletonized. But his mask still sat in place on his skull. Thinking he should try to bring Deon back to the surface, Shaw wrapped his arms around the body and tried to lift. But Deon wouldn't move. His air tanks and the battery pack for his light appeared to be stuck in the mud underneath him, and Shaw was starting to pant from the struggle. "This isn't wise," he said to himself. He was at 270 meters and working way too hard for a human that far down. He was already a minute over his planned bottom time, so Shaw quickly tied the cave reel to Deon's tanks. This was so the body could easily be found again. He then returned to the shot line to start his ascent. Approaching 400 feet, almost an hour into the dive, Shaw met up with his close friend, Don Shirley. Don was a 48-year-old British expat. He ran a technical diving school in Badplaats, South Africa. After Don checked that Dave was okay, and also retrieved some of the spare gas cylinders hanging on a shot line below, Shaw showed him an underwater slate on which he had written 270 meters, found the body. Don's eyebrows shot up inside his mask. He reached out to shake his friend's hand. Don Shirley then left Dave Shaw, who had another 8 hours and 40 minutes of decompression to complete. As Shirley ascended, he realised that Dave would not be able to resist coming back to try to recover Deon one more time. He was so close to succeeding, he couldn't leave it like this. Don himself would be okay with leaving the body where it was, but Dave was a man who dived to pass the limits of what people thought was possible. In this dive alone, he had just hit a record depth on a rebreather, and now he had the opportunity to return a boy to his parents and, in the process, do something equally as stunning, make the deepest body recovery in the world. So he returned to the surface, regrouped and planned his second attempt. Dave Shaw arrived in Johannesburg 6 days before his second dive. His first destination was Kamati Springs. There he practiced placing a body into a bag underwater. In this instance, Don Shirley acted as Deon. The trial took place at a depth of 66 feet. Everything went smoothly, taking Shaw just a few minutes. And so the following day, Dave and Don drove to Mount Carmel. There they were joined by 7 South African rebreather divers hand-picked by Shirley, as well as by a police team from Cape Town and Pretoria, as a deceased body was obviously involved. The dive was scheduled for Saturday, January the 8th. Don had orchestrated a well-detailed dive plan. Dave Shaw's dive was expected to last around 12 hours, starting at 6 a.m. The other divers' schedules were coordinated with Dave's, each targeting specific depths to either help Dave or to help bring Deon's body to the surface. The first person Shaw would see on his ascent was Shirley at 725 feet. That is where Dave would hand over the body bag. Ideally, Deon's body would be out of the water about 80 minutes after Shaw began his dive. To minimize risks, Shirley planned 35 backup gas cylinders to be available. This would make sure there'd be more than enough supply to handle any rebreather failures. He also organised a rope and sling system provided by the police. A specialist in diving physiology was also hired to handle any medical emergencies. But despite all the risks, Dave was still quietly confident. He was careful to tell reporters and the team that the effort was an attempted recovery. The safety of the living would be put first. He also admitted that part of the motivation was the thrill of the adventure, even as some of the team members praised the efforts as a noble endeavour for the Dreyer family. There was one technical issue that Dave needed to address. This was the addition of an underwater camera housing. The camera placed on a climbing helmet was not Shaw's usual gear. He usually used a high-intensity light on his hand. This was something he could normally sling around his neck when necessary. So this helmet camera posed a new challenge, but after testing it in a pool and on a 500-foot dive, Dave was satisfied with the new setup. The night before the dive arrived. Everyone taking part gathered for a final briefing. Dave Shaw emphasised how important personal safety is over the mission. He urged each diver to prioritise their own well-being. He also had a private conversation with Don Shirley. He had upgraded his rebreather with an oil-filled controller to potentially reach the bottom of Bushman's hole. Dave told Don to assist only if signalled, and the two of them left the team with one last message. If either of them did not survive the dive, they did not want to be recovered. At 4 a.m. on Saturday, January the 8th, Dave Shaw and Don Shirley woke in the dark to prepare for their dive. Don had had a difficult night. Preparing the night before, a wire snapped as he was changing the battery on his new controller. This meant that he now couldn't dive, something which devastated him. But still, Dave was ready to go it alone. By 9 p.m. that night, he went to bed. In the meantime, with the help of the controller company, a soldering iron and some tinfoil, they miraculously managed to fix Shirley's controller. So this meant that Don could now once more join Dave on the dive. The team was back together. In the grey pre-dawn light, Shaw and Shirley drove to the hole, listening to music to relax. Given the potential length of the time underwater, Shirley included an adult diaper. The rest of the team, support divers, police divers and paramedics all assembled, and the area around the surface pool became crowded with dive equipment. Werner van Schaik, a 35-year-old South African, who set the women's depth record at a staggering 725 feet at Bushman's hole in October, set up tables and equipment around the hole. Shirley had asked her to act as surface marshal. At 6:13 a.m, with a video camera quietly whirring on his head, Dave Shaw took Don's hand and said, "I'll see you in 20 minutes. And so he disappeared into the dark waters of Bushman's hole. A few minutes later, Theo and Marie Dreyer arrived at the water's edge. They had arrived a little later to avoid putting any extra pressure on Dave Shaw. Dave descended quickly, letting the shot line slip through his fingers as he went. He reached the bottom of the hole in 11 minutes, even faster than planned. He immediately swam along the cave line. Upon seeing the remains once more, he pulled out the body bag. He then knelt alongside Deon and started to get to work. At this time, it was likely that Dave felt the narcosis, feeling as though he had drunk 4 or 5 strong drinks. He had now been at the bottom of Bushman's hole at 886 feet for just over 1 minute. 13 minutes after Shaw dove, Don Shirley got the go signal from Van Schaik. He then descended to his meeting point with Shaw at 725 feet. Approaching 500 feet, Don saw Dave's light about 400 feet below him, near the shot line. But the light wasn't moving. Don knew instantly that something had gone wrong. Dave was with Deon's body. His mission seemed to be going well, and he was about to bring the 20-year-old home to his parents. However, struggling to retrieve him for 6 minutes, he reached the time limit he had stated on his mission plan. He now had to return to the surface. However, he got tangled with the rope attached to Deon. This was the very line that Dave himself had placed to help find Deon. All of the equipment needed for the dive, mixed with an enclosed space and ropes, really was a recipe for disaster. A momentary lapse in his calm demeanor, along with the physical exertion, caused Dave's breathing to become more rapid. This led to the CO2 in his body to rise to dangerous levels. On the surface world, it would be something akin to hyperventilation, but to the point where consciousness was lost. And when that happens at such a depth and such a pressure, it is a very, very bad thing. By this time, over 20 minutes into the dive, Dave should have been ascending. However, only bubbles from venting gases in his rebreather and dry suit were visible. But there was no movement, only that one single still light. Don remained calm. He knew that emotion and panic had no place in these dark depths. And though Dave hadn't signaled for help, Don decided to go to the bottom. A motionless diver at 886 feet was not a good sign, but Shirley had to see if he could help him. Okay, here we go then, he said to himself. At about 800 feet, deeper than he had ever been, Shirley heard a large crack and then a thud. The controller on his left forearm had been crushed. Without it, he would now have to manually monitor and inject oxygen into his rebreather. This was a full-time task, an emergency routine at a life-threatening depth. Don now realized that if he went down to try and help Dave, he would surely join him in eternity. So instead, he decided to ascend. Don regained control of his rebreather and started up the shot line, flipping through alternate decompression profiles on his slates. He faced at least another 10 agonizing hours in the water, knowing his friend was lost below him. After just a few minutes, Dave's light was swallowed up by the darkness below. A heroic attempt to bring a young man home to his family had actually left another family 1 member short. One more diver claimed by Bushman's hole. 3 days later, both Dave and Deon, still attached to the line, were raised to the surface. Their equipment was retrieved, including Dave's headcam, the footage of which you have been watching in this video. 51-year-old Dave Shaw and the remains of 20-year-old Deon Dyer were finally retrieved. Dave's post-mortem confirmed that an excessive buildup of carbon dioxide caused his demise. He stopped breathing just 22 minutes into the dive.